my boy, Toby. You're my boy. So Spider-Man tells the story of a teenager who is bitten by a radioactive spider and gains superpowers to begin protecting the city of New York. What's up, guys, and welcome to my Spider-Man review series. Next week we have the debut of Spider-Man No Way Home, and I have not really talked about the original Sam Raimi trilogy nor the two Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man films on this channel yet, so felt like a bit of a void, and I really do enjoy especially that original trilogy and even a lot of elements of the Andrew Garfield movies, so it felt like a perfect time to finally give my thoughts on all 5 of these movies. I have already reviewed the 2 Tom Holland movies. My channel was already running, so if you want to know my thoughts on Homecoming or my thoughts on Far From Home, those reviews are already up. They're still pretty current. There's not really a whole lot that I would change, so I didn't see the point in updating them, being that they're only a couple of years old. And I'm not going to be reviewing Spider-Verse as well. Even though I really enjoyed that movie, I don't really tend to do too many animated reviews. They don't perform very well on my channel. So we will do a ranking once No Way Home comes out. I'll probably do a spoiler review as well, even though most of us, at least I assume, pretty much know all the things they're trying to hide and failing miserably at. But I'm going to keep my mind open that there might still be some genuine shocks and surprises in that movie. So going to be talking Spider-Man along with Matrix over the next couple of weeks. Now, as far as this first movie, Spider-Man 2002, this was a very important movie to me. And I think this is one of those movies and one of those franchises, really, that has very different importance to different generations. This is one of the few, especially superhero properties, that have been redone so many times since comic book movies have become a major thing that each individual franchise, each individual casting of Spider-Man kind of defines a generation, to where a lot of people that grew up in my era tend to at least love or have a lot of nostalgia for that Sam Raimi trilogy, if not prefer those as their favorite Spider-Man portrayals. And then you have a generation that's just maybe 10 years older that feels that way about Andrew Garfield, and then now the newer generation that really is growing up with the MCU, where they're kind of spoiled, where comic book movies are so common and they're the biggest thing out that it's really nothing special to see one. When you go back to 2002, this was still a rarity. This was still something that way more times than not was a gigantic fail whenever a big studio tried to bring a comic book property to some type of movie adaptation. We just got Blade a couple years prior, we got X-Men, and I still love those movies for the same reasons that I love this. You know, very important, very huge landmark movies, and movies that I grew up loving and still love a lot as an adult, even if some aspects of it don't age so well. But I remember distinctly Spider-Man coming out was this gigantic deal because the landscape was just starting to change. Not a whole lot of people knew that Blade was a comic book movie. I think most people, including myself, just saw it as a kick-ass action horror movie with Wesley Snipes as a vampire, only retroactively learning that it was a Marvel property. X-Men was really the first one that everybody knew was comic books, that everybody grew up with, that everybody casted a lot of doubt on and then was shocked at how awesome that movie ended up being. And so the landscape in 2002, when they announced that Spider-Man, one of the biggest and most popular superheroes in existence, was finally coming to the big screen after decades of failed attempts to bring it to the big screen. This was just huge. There was a video game coming out, there was posters and standees all over the place. I remember even just going to Best Buy and getting any action movie, it seemed like. There was these little stickers like, hey, save $5 off of your ticket to Spider-Man. This was a very exciting time to be a comic book fan. And when this movie dropped, it literally propelled forward whatever potential, whatever excitement, whatever confidence not only movie studios but movie audiences had in comic book films to a brand new level. This was the one that catapulted comic book films into a serious commodity and has since paved the way for things like the MCU, like the DC Universe, like all of the great standalone Marvel and DC properties that we have gotten since 2002 before shared universes became a thing. And a lot of people tend to forget that, or a lot of people don't really have the nostalgia or the context or the memories to really appreciate how landmark this movie was in 2002. And that's a big frustration for me with Spider-Man fans and with comic book fans, is that people really don't appreciate the context of an era whenever it comes to these Spider-Man movies. I remember everybody and their mother loving these Raimi films, to where when the second one came out, the excitement was through the roof. When the third one came out, the excitement was even higher. And then when the Amazing Spider-Man movies came out, it seemed like the majority instantly fell in love with that and immediately started shitting on everything that Sam Raimi and these three movies accomplished in the previous iteration. And then I saw it happen again when Spider-Man joined the MCU and we got the Tom Holland version, to where everybody immediately, even the ones that loved the Andrew Garfield and hailed that as the greatest Spider-Man iteration ever, immediately started shitting on that era, as if that was even bigger of a fail, and now we finally have the true Spider-Man. And it's kind of baffling. You know, I can appreciate it. I can appreciate the different context of the different generations and the different, the different lenses that we all see these movies through, depending on what age we were when we first experienced them. But it's frustrating that this movie series especially doesn't really seem to get the credit that it deserves, and doesn't really seem to get the appreciation that it deserves from modern comic book movie fans. Starting right off with my positives for the original Spider-Man, this is what I think of when I just think of a good, classic comic book film. Don't get me wrong, I love the MCU, I love the DC universe, I love even the Fox X-Men universe. I love shared universes, and I love how epic and how grand scale and how successful comic book movies have become nowadays, to where we almost have too much content. Between Disney Plus and all of the movies and everything, I mean, it's mind-boggling just trying to keep up with all of it, with how popular and how dime a dozen comic book movies are nowadays. But when I go back and I think about the day before we had so much comic book film, before that really ruled the box office, I appreciate a lot of those standalone movies. I appreciate the Dark Knight trilogy. I appreciate the Spider-Man movies, even standalone movies that came out like Kick-Ass, that were just its own little thing. I kind of long for more movies like that, and that's kind of the reason why I appreciate that the DC universe especially was starting to do more movies like that, like with the Joker, where it's just its own thing. And we're probably going to get a lot more from that universe, and potentially Marvel could end up doing the same thing at some point. But when I think of classic, good old-fashioned, standalone superhero films, the Spider-Man movies, especially this first one, that first origin story, that introduction to this character and to this world and to the potential of superhero movies, this is what I think of. And it just does such a good, classic, tried and true origin story in a very efficient way too, to where it gets out all the things that you need to know about Spider-Man. It gets out all the different relationships and all the different complications between all the characters, and sets up one of the main villains, and has a nice little arc for not only Peter Parker but also Green Goblin as a villain. It resolves all of that in a really nice way, to where even if for whatever reason, if this was the only Spider-Man movie that we ever got, at least from this version of the character, it feels like a complete story that leaves some things open, for sure, for the sequel, but it comes to a complete close. It comes to a nice, satisfying close as a movie. And more oftentimes than not, nowadays, we're just busy setting up everything else. We're busy putting 9 steps ahead for what's coming down the line, and not just focusing on telling a great individual story. That's what this movie accomplished. You have this kid, this nerdy guy that's very relatable for a lot of us, and very sympathetic for a lot of us, and almost in an entertaining way how nerdy he is. But he gets this larger-than-life chance, this larger-than-life responsibility, and rises to the occasion to save people, to save a world that, up until that point, has all but rejected him constantly. I mean, aside from his aunt and uncle, and aside from his best friend Harry, he really doesn't have anybody that really welcomes him as a person. And then all of a sudden now he's this huge celebrity, he's this person that women long for, that guys want to be, that bad guys fear, and he can't tell anybody. He can't pull an Iron Man and say, "I'm Iron Man, bitch, I'm Spider-Man, motherfuckers, come on, now you want me, don't you?" He can't do that. And it really makes this character one of the most relatable superheroes, one of the most relatable comic book characters in existence, especially in the movie world, just because of that internal struggle that he is always going through, that they just reinforce with the sequels of trying to balance Peter Parker's life with Spider-Man's responsibility. And this movie and this trilogy is amongst the most emotional of any comic book properties out there, with how different relationships develop regarding his love, his affection, and eventual kind of distance from Mary Jane, his father and son relationship with Uncle Ben, and then the eventual father and son type relationship that he has with Norman Osborn. It's all things that are set up and put into such an emotional, grounded, real-world way that even though we're seeing this larger-than-life character do these larger-than-life things, it feels very real, and it feels very much like things that a lot of us have experienced before regarding grief, regarding regret, regarding, you know, that love that you want or a love that you can't have, or complications with friendships, all of that. This movie does a fantastic job at building all these different layers with these characters and all these different emotions that you don't typically see in comic book movies, aside from all of the big action sequences and the huge CGI effects. This movie really does have a heartbeat, and this movie does have a direction that it wants to go story first. It wants to go characters first, which again is something that you can't say for a ton of comic book movies, especially nowadays when it's all about the bigger universes, it's all about the setups of other films, it's all about how we can top what we've already done, when a lot of times I wish movies would go back and just try to tell a great story with great characters. And it really helps that this movie casted pretty much every single role perfectly. Whether or not they wrote each role in a great way, we'll get into, but the casting of Toby Maguire, I remember being so skeptical to where I'm like, who is this guy? That's not a big tough guy. That's not an Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not a Bruce Willis. Only those types of guys can be heroes. Only those types of guys can lead big A-list action movies. What the fuck is this guy doing? Immediately proven wrong, and now, even to this day, he's my favorite iteration of Spider-Man, and he's one of my favorite portrayals of a comic book character. So perfect. The way that he kind of balances that likable nerdiness, that naiveness that you want in a character like Peter Parker, but also has the physicality, also has the attitude, also has the snarkiness that you want from Spider-Man. So I have always loved Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man. I love James Franco in the role of Harry Osborn. I think that he has great chemistry with Tobey Maguire, as well as Kirsten Dunst, and even Norman Osborn himself with the Willem Dafoe, that whole father-son dynamic that they have where there's a lot of tension. I just think that he has a lot of different layers to his character, and this was very early on in James Franco's career too, where he's gone in a lot of different directions since then. He's done raunchy comedies, he's done dramas, he's done Oscar-type roles, and nowadays you don't hear from him anymore, which we won't even get into that, but anyway, wasted potential, I guess, what we can call that. Kirsten Dunst, regardless of how I feel about the way they portray the character, which I will get into, I think she does a really good job at giving the type of Mary Jane that they wanted to give. And just like with James Franco, I think that her chemistry with everybody is really strong. I believe kind of that tug and pull relationship that she has with Tobey Maguire. I believe that tug and pull relationship that she has with James Franco. I even like her interactions with Aunt May. I think she's a very likable version of Mary Jane, with the exception of some of the promiscuousness and everything that I'll get into, but nonetheless, her being kind of the central figure of Spider-Man's love, which kind of becomes a recurring theme throughout this trilogy, I think that she's pretty damn good casting, and I always think of her when I think of Mary Jane, for better or worse. And then you've got Willem Dafoe, who alongside Tobey Maguire is probably the most memorable performance in this movie for a lot of different reasons, and for some that might, not feel the same way because of how bombastic he is and for how over the top that he is, but for this old school comic book movie, for such a campy take, which is something that you just have to expect when you're gonna have Sam Raimi in charge of your storytelling, I think that he does a great job at being scary, being menacing, being, very scenery chewing, but at the same time being over the top, being ridiculous, being silly to a certain degree, to where Green Goblin really is very memorable. I mean, whether or not you love this movie or not, there is so much excitement in No Way Home when just seeing that little pumpkin bomb hit and hearing that laugh, it's like, oh, the man's coming back. And he does a great job at showing all these different dynamics, not only with this character, but with the character interactions that the character has. So like there's scenes where he's talking to himself because the Green Goblin's like a bad personality in his head that he has to switch back and forth in the middle of a scene that's very entertaining and he's very effective at. But even the way that he builds his relationships with his son, Harry, as well as Toby Maguire's Peter Parker, to where you see the loving father, you see the concerned father, but you also see kind of the distant father at the same time, to where he instantly takes to Toby Maguire and is trying to help him out and is trying to give him all of these opportunities that he kind of feels like Harry has wasted along the way. You know, somebody that has had every opportunity given to him and fucked up numerous times, versus somebody like Toby that is poor, for lack of a better word, and very cast aside from society and has had little to no advantages in life. And he kind of, you know, lends his hand out, especially after Uncle Ben dies in the movie. I've always wanted more from those characters, and that's something, again, I'm going to get into in the mix, but there was such a strong dynamic between this little father-son triangle that I really wish that this was something that recurred more throughout the trilogy. And you can't talk about this movie and the impact that it made in 2002 without talking about how great the special effects and all of the different action sequences were. Yes, they don't compare to modern day stuff, which again just goes back to what I said about context and different generations, but this was back in the day when you would think something like Spider-Man would almost be unfilmable, or at least not filmable in a way that would be convincing for more than 2 or 3 years. And they really did a fantastic job at making effects and making sequences and doing a lot of very early on CGI in such a convincing way that even watching it just a couple of days ago here in 2021, it still really holds up. I mean, it still is escapism. It's not a movie that feels like one of those early 2000s movies that just barely was touching what CGI could do, but they were just way too overambitious for what the technology could handle at the time. They really did a great job at making it larger than life while grounded. And that's something that you cannot say for very many movies from that era. And finally, this is by far one of my favorite comic book scores of all time by Danny Elfman. Now, I'm somebody that doesn't speak on scores very often. It's not necessarily something I'm very educated on or can speak very accurately on when I start getting in depth with it. But when you do hear me talk about scores, you know that I love that score. You know that I was impressed, because Spider-Man is one of those scores where you can just hear a couple of notes of it and instantly think Spider-Man, instantly think of this movie. And even if it wasn't belonging to a movie, it feels very, very belonging of the character. And that's something that scores can't always capture. They can be a good score for an action movie, a good score for a comic book movie, a good score in general, but they don't always have those notes and those flavors that feel like the character that they're a part of. It doesn't feel like the universe that they're a part of. Something I'm probably going to talk about in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which had an amazing score that did not feel like a Spider-Man score whatsoever. The Danny Elfman Spider-Man score that we got in the Raimi trilogy is perfection in my mind. Moving on to the mixed aspects, one of the main ones is the campiness, and that's honestly the element that ages this movie the most and turns off a lot of modern people the most. And that's something that, as a fan of most of Sam Raimi's movies, I kind of just accept that this movie is a part of his vision and a part of his style, and to me it fits very well for what he is doing with this trilogy and with this movie. But there are elements of it that goes a little bit too far for me. There are elements of it that feel like they don't belong the older the movie gets. A lot of it comes from Green Goblin. A lot of it is just the lines and the banter back and forth between him and Spider-Man. I mean, just moments like whenever he pulls the wires out of his glider and he's like, "We'll meet again, Spider-Man!" It feels so 60s cartoon that it fits the tone of the movie, but that's something that just doesn't necessarily work the older that this movie gets. And even other elements of it, to where he's flying around the itsy bitsy spider, and just, like I said, it's so over the top of a performance that I can't help but smile and love it for better or worse. But I kind of do long for a version of this movie that tapers that down a little bit and takes itself a little bit more seriously.
Shazam! Go! Go! Go, Web, go!
And I'm also mixed on the way that they utilized the Green Goblin storyline here. Now, while I was really appreciative and while I was praising how lean of a movie this is and how focused and efficient it is with how it writes its story and how it tells its story, there's a lot of untapped potential in that Green Goblin storyline that has always made me feel like it shouldn't have been just a one and done story with one movie. I think they do a really good job here at making it fit as an origin story and a one and done story, and you just see the ripple effects of this through Harry Osborn for the next 2 movies. But there's so much here as far as just the classic rivalry between Spider-Man and Green Goblin, who is essentially his arch nemesis. That is the Joker of the Spider-Man world. And you don't necessarily feel that by the end of this trilogy. You kind of feel like Doc Ock is much more the Joker of that universe. But there's so much there to where Green Goblin is the character that has affected the character of Spider-Man the most, that has caused the most pain, the most tragedy, the most damage to his life, namely with the death of Gwen Stacy, which they kind of retroactively recreate here with Mary Jane in a much less effective way, that it feels like that should have been planned out as a trilogy arc when they came up with this. Now, I think it has more to do with the fact that comic book movies were very, very lucky to have one good movie, let alone a trilogy, to why they weren't thinking that far ahead. But in retrospect, I think that would have been the right move. There was so much there involving the characters of Peter and Harry and Norman that feel like they didn't get to fully blossom and fully develop the way that they should have over multiple movies, as well as the rivalry and the villainy that Green Goblin himself is. And my other mixed aspect of this movie is the portrayal of Mary Jane Watson, at least the writing of that character. Now, on one end, like I said, I like Kirsten Dunst a lot. She is kind of what I see when I think of Mary Jane now, and I like her chemistry with all of the characters, and I think that they utilize her pretty well in the first 2 movies. Not so much the third one, but we'll get there. But let's be honest, like she's young in this movie, she's still a teenager, so it's a little bit more acceptable, a little bit more easy to defend on just a human level, but Mary Jane's a bit of a hoe in this trilogy, really. I mean, this movie, she's dating what is obviously the biggest douchebag in high school. Even if you're in the popular clique, you know you're dating the asshole of the school. And she immediately goes from that and then just jumps into the Harry Osborn train and starts dating him, and never really even feels like she likes him all that much, because while she's dating Harry, she's also falling in love with Spider-Man and also kind of flirting around with Peter. I mean, there's scenes where they're talking to each other and they're catching up, haven't seen each other in a while, and she's like egging him on, like wanting him to come on to her, where she's like, oh, you know, you just asking out of interest, when he's asking about Harry and how they're doing. It's like, oh, just a question, Peter? Like she wants Peter to want her, and she knows Peter wants her and has always wanted her. You have to be fucking blind to not know that, whether or not she acknowledged him beforehand or not. But for the most part in this trilogy, but in this movie as well, she is just tied between all of these men, and that is kind of her focal point as a character, is which alliance is she going to choose? Which path of love is she going to take? Who is she going to lay in bed with? Is it going to be Harry, Spider-Man, or Peter? And watching it now, that's an element that it was always there, but it stood out to me a lot on this rewatch, especially knowing where they eventually take her character in the next 2 movies, which yet again stick with that love triangle thing and her trying to decide where her heart lies. It's just, they never really did anything new with her beyond this. So while that might have been fine for 1 movie, if they had changed it up in the next 2, it probably wouldn't be as big of a deal, but since that's all they really did with their character, it stands out a lot more on rewatch. Now, as far as negatives, I genuinely only have one, and that's the Green Goblin suit.
Hello, my dear.
It seems like all of my negatives revolve around Green Goblin one way or another, even though I really love this character and love this portrayal. That's how conflicted of a review this is to a certain extent because of my nostalgia. But the Green Goblin costume in this movie has never really looked great, has never really looked intimidating for sure, and that's another element of the movie that ages very poorly along with the campiness. It looks, you get a lot of comparisons nowadays to a Power Rangers suit. That's kind of the most common nickname that it's given that I have seen, and it's especially hurtful whenever you know the early versions of the costume, which understandably, when you look at the footage, is probably a little bit too terrifying for the audiences that they were going for, but much more comic book accurate and much more memorable and much more acceptable as a live action version of Green Goblin in my mind. And there's a reason why in No Way Home they've already pretty much revealed that Willem Dafoe is just going to be wearing a hood and doing the glider, because there's just no way to make that suit be able to be taken seriously, especially in a modern context of a comic book film. But story-wise, I don't think it makes any sense as far as the glider suit, this whole militaristic application they're trying to get all this funding for. That suit is not going to be in the military. I'm sorry, it's not. And where the fuck did the whole goblin head thing come from? I just never really liked it. But overall, guys, I understand that this movie is a very subjective thing, that certainly nostalgia will always play a huge part in how much you love or hate this movie. But for somebody that grew up with this trilogy from the time they were 12 years old, and this really defined not only a generation of comic book movies, but defined Spider-Man for them, I adore this movie. I have always loved it. I've even loved it more as time has gone on because I long for that version of storytelling in comic book movie adaptations nowadays. But I understand and I totally acknowledge that nostalgia plays a huge part in that. There's certainly a lot of campiness and a lot of stylistic choices that you could not succeed with nowadays, and that makes people very hesitant, if not blocked off completely, to appreciating this movie on the level that I think that it deserves. So if you're a fan of classic origin stories and don't mind a little bit of camp in your superhero movies, this is one of the best superhero origin stories and one of the best starts to a movie trilogy in my mind. So if you do not already own this, please go out and buy it. So what do you guys think of Spider-Man 2002? Are you a fan of the Raimi trilogy? Is that your Spider-Man? Or have you never liked these movies, even if you were in my generation and my age? Or have you just went back and started watching them? What is your thoughts? Do you like it for what it was, or do you just not get into it and think it's a relic of the past? Let me know all of your thoughts down below, guys. And what is your favorite of this Spider-Man Raimi trilogy? Tomorrow we're going to talk about Spider-Man 2, and then Saturday, Spider-Man 3, before we pick up the next week with the Amazing Spider-Man films. So please like and share this video, and hit that subscribe button if you are a Marvel fan or a Spider-Man fan, so you do not miss any of that coverage over the next couple of weeks. Thank you guys for watching as always, and remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.